Yeah, and I guess for some, the issue is they feel not only uncertain about the Bible, but uncertain about everything in life. And Vince, I think this is where our next questioner is coming from. This is anonymously been asked, but someone says, as an agnostic, I don't understand how you can be confident that there is life after death. Surely it's actually arrogant to claim that you can know that God exists.
Well, thank you for this question. And I appreciate that your starting point is agnosticism. I appreciate that because there's a lot of people who don't believe that there's evidence for God or for the Christian faith, and they jump really quickly to atheism. Now, myself, Joe, Abdu, as he explained, I would really disagree with that claim that there's not evidence for God and evidence for the Christian faith, and that was a big part of my own coming to faith in my college years. But lack of evidence doesn't lead to atheism, it leads to agnosticism. So you're right to start there. Alvin Plantinga gives this example. He said, we don't have any evidence about whether there are an even number of stars in the universe or an odd number of stars in the universe. We have no evidence about that. So it would be very odd then to conclude that there is not an even number of stars in the universe, or that there is not an odd number of stars in the universe. No, lack of evidence leads to agnosticism, not to atheism. So your starting point is correct. And once you get to agnosticism, you're in a really interesting place, because then you're saying that there is the very real possibility of God existing. And then that raises the question, well, what should we do now? Should we remain agnostic just because God is something that we can't fully comprehend? I'm not sure about that. There's all sorts of things in life that we can't fully comprehend. Having a child, that's certainly something that you fully can't fully comprehend both, I guess, unless you've had a child. I mean, actually, even if you have had a child, you can't fully comprehend that. Especially if you've had a child, you can't fully comprehend that. And, Joe and I, we have a 1-year-old, our first child, and we had lots of discussions and a lot of prayer about whether we were going to try to have our own biological child. And there were lots of good reasons for that, but there were some challenging reasons against as well. Maybe it would be better for us to adopt a child. Do we really want to bring in a child to this world with all of its suffering, with all the travel that we do? Could we really give a child a good childhood? There were reasons for or against. But at some point, if we just remained in agnosticism, that would, in essence, have been choosing not to have a child. And William James made the same point about God in his essay, The Will to Believe. He said, at some point in your agnosticism, if you continue to say, I defer on whether to step into relationship with God, that is precisely a form of not stepping into relationship with God. Now, Pascal said, in his view, he felt that there was enough evidence to believe in God rationally, but not so much evidence that we could believe in God based on reason alone. And he thought that was intentional. If all God wanted was intellectual assent, he could get that pretty easily. He could just show up in a majestic way. He could have the Greek New Testament written on every atom, and we would find that in microscopes, and then we would just know that God exists. He can get intellectual assent pretty easily, but probably the best translation of the biblical word for belief is trust. And if you want trust, you need to get that in a different way, not just by overpowering someone, but by showing someone your character and building that trust. And so Pascal thought it was intentional that God gives us clear evidence, strong evidence, but evidence such that we would not come to believe in God just because he's overpowering, but based on his character, that we would follow him not just because he's powerful, but because he's trustworthy. So then we get to the other part of your question. Is it arrogant then to claim to know that God exists? And here's why I don't think so. Because there are many things in life that are only known up close, that cannot be known from a distance. You can't know how to ride a bike in the deep sense of the term from a distance. You have to actually do it. You can't be an art critic without actually going to see the art. You can't be a food critic without putting the food in your mouth. In philosophy, we call this non-propositional knowledge, and lots of our knowledge is like this, and in particular, our knowledge of relationships is like this. My knowledge of Joe is like this. Pascal said that in order to know the truth, you must love the truth. I had to make a decision to be willing to take a step of relational trust towards Jo, to be willing to love her before I could actually know her in the deepest sense. There are certain things I could know about her before I made that decision, but if I really wanted to know her in the deepest senses of the term, I was going to have to take a step of relational trust first. The existentialists were right about that. Personal commitment precedes the deepest forms of knowledge. Now, there are two ways to choose a coat. G.K. Chesterton used this analogy. He used it in a slightly different way. But there are two ways to choose a coat. One way is to look at all the measurements. Okay, you can read all the measurements of this jacket, and I can make a decision about whether or not I think it will fit. Another way to choose a jacket is to put it on and to see if it fits. Now, I think both ways are important. I never even would have tried on the jacket of faith unless I had looked at the measurements of science and philosophy and history and sociology, as Abdu and I were doing in the same year, in the year 2000. But nothing substitutes for actually putting the coat on. And once you put the coat on, you know that it fits. And no one's going to be able to convince you that it doesn't fit. I'm wearing it. And somebody could look at the measurements here and say, but look, the measurements don't line up. That doesn't look like the right size for you. But I'm wearing this coat, and I see that it fits. And so the evidence is significant, and it gets us to that point where we have to be willing to take a step out of agnosticism and into relational trust. But ultimately, at some point, we do need to try the jacket on. And Jesus even says, clothe yourself in me. Clothe yourself in Christ. He says, taste and see that the Lord is good. And for me, one of the things that meant was praying an agnostic's prayer. I used to pray it in my dorm room. God, I don't know if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I would really like to know about it. And I think God really honors that type of prayer. He really honored that prayer when I spoke it, and he met me on my knees in my dorm room in 122 Jolene Hall in a really profound and lasting way. And not that long ago, when I was speaking somewhere, a woman came up to me at the end of the event, and she said, "Did you say 122 Jolene Hall?" I don't normally mention that detail, but I happened to on that night. I said, yes. She seemed very emotional. She said, I lived in 121 Jolene Hall. And she was about 15 years older than me. And she said, and I spent my 4 years in college praying for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall. She said, all these years I had thought that God never heard and never responded to my prayer, but he answered my prayer literally word for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall. Now, if you want to lean in the direction of atheism, can you chalk that up to a coincidence? Maybe. But if there's a God, that tells us something very different. That tells us that long before I ever even thought about God, he was not agnostic about me. He was pursuing me and pursuing me. 15 years prior to my even thinking about him, he had people praying for me so that 15 years later on that floor in 122 Jolene Hall, I could give my life to him. Could it be the case that he's pursuing you and he's been pursuing you long before this evening, but even this evening, as he continues to pursue you, he has taken that step of relational trust towards you? Would you be willing to take that step of relational trust back towards him? That agnostic's prayer, that seeker's prayer, it's so powerful. God, I don't know if you're there, but if you are, I'd like to know about it. I hope people will pray that prayer tonight if you're not sure who Jesus is.